So welcome everyone to the first AviaDev Europe webinar. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Juraj Toth and I'm a Managing Director at AviaDev Europe. AviaDev Europe is a route development forum focused on developing connectivity of European regional airports by providing the platform to network, negotiate new routes and exchange experiences and ideas between professionals from the airports, airlines, tourism authorities and aviation suppliers. And after organizing two successful events in Valencia, AviaDev Europe 2020 is planned to be held this November, and we will reveal the dates and the location, of course, as soon as possible. Prior to joining AviaDev in June 2018, I spent 7 years at Košice International Airport in Slovakia, where I am still based, by the way. I was responsible for route development, airline marketing, non-aviation marketing, PR. So I have the first-hand experience from working for a small regional airport, and I know exactly how tough life and business can be sometimes for all regional airports out there. At AviaDev Europe, we do our best to stay in touch with our community on a year-round basis. That's why we have two podcast shows, AviaDev Inside Europe with over 60 episodes and AviaDev Weekly News. We just started it in last November with 18 episodes already. Both shows totaling over 8,000 downloads in 61 countries. Both shows are available also on many platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Very interesting aviation content, perfect for your run, for your dog walk, for your commute, or just when you want to have a little break from other members of your household, as we are all as many of us are being locked down at our homes these days. And in order to serve our community also on a year-round basis, we are today starting a series of these webinars. The history of the world will be divided before and after the COVID-19 outbreak. Our thoughts and prayers are with those who are fighting the virus in the front line all over the world, and especially with all our friends in Italy and Spain, where they suffer the most at the moment. All the rest of us, we need to stay at home and follow the instructions of authorities. What is already happening as a direct consequence of the outbreak is a global recession, which will have a massive impact on our industry. Aviation has been facing turbulences of various kinds for over a century, but what we are seeing right now, with air travel literally being stopped on a global level, that's something we haven't seen before. Aviation leaders all over the world have been very vocal that without support from the government, we will see many airlines collapsing. But we are here today not to cry about how bad the situation is. We all know it's very, very serious. But we want, of course, to analyze where we are. And also we want to take a look on the way forward. What will happen after the crisis will end, because it will end one day. And also we want to emphasize a couple of positives at the very end of this webinar. So before I will introduce our today's speakers, let me do a quick technical housekeeping. For today's webinars, only our panelists, our speakers, and myself are able to use microphones. Of course, all of you who are listening are welcome to ask questions. Please use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen for asking questions. And the whole today's sessions will be recorded and we will put it on YouTube probably tomorrow. So you will be able to share it with your friends and colleagues or watch it again if you like. Make yourself comfortable. We are about to start, but I have one last thing to do before I will open the floor to the panelists, and that's a poll. So that's another way how you can share your opinions with us by voting in a poll. So I'm starting the first poll. Please answer the question. Just a second. Yes, so here's the question one. You should all see now. Do you agree that government should prioritize the airline sector when deciding about how to support the economy following the damage caused by COVID-19 outbreak? So easy question, yes or no. Please vote. Now I have started the poll, so once again, do you agree that government should prioritize the airline sector when deciding about how to support the economy following the damage caused by COVID-19 outbreak. So no surprise, as expected, it's very much in favor of yes. So at the moment, it's 80% of people voting agree that the airline sector should be prioritized by the government. So we have 78% of people already voted. So I will end the poll now. So it's 75 versus 25%. So not really surprising. Following up on the question, I have a couple of figures from IATA to share with you, documenting how vital aviation is for the business, for the economies of countries all around Europe. So we can see, for example, in Spain or in Greece, it supports around 10% of the GDP of respective countries, and all across the globe, Europe is not an exception. Millions of jobs are being supported, over 1 million jobs in France, in Germany, 1.5 million in UK, almost 2 million in Spain, so it's really massive. So now, finally, without further ado, let me welcome today's speakers. Jeremy Robinson, partner at Watson, Farley & Williams, specialist on EU and competition law and aviation law, and John Grant, partner at MIDAS Aviation and AviaDev Consult, aviation consultant with tons of experience from the industry. So welcome to the panel, gentlemen. And John, let's start with you. We know that situation is more dramatic than ever before. Can you share with us what the numbers show?
Sure. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. I guess it's better than having your lunch to listen to us for 40 minutes or so. So I've put together some slides that I've shared and publish every week for OAG through some of their blogs. So some of the content you'll see here you've seen before, but there are a couple of bits at the end which are perhaps a more optimistic spin on where we are and how far through this process we've still got to go. So Juraj, if you wouldn't mind moving on, please. For the first slide, I thought I'd look at the global perspective, and I started tracking this around the 20th of January, and I said to OAG, do you want me to do something on this, because I think it might be quite a big event? And they said, let us think about it. But we are now 10 weeks into this, and this gives you a sense of the scale of what is happening and how quickly it has started to happen. There has been a steady decline in capacity over the last 10 weeks, and there have been some real hotspots that I've commented on before, such as Northeast Asia, where China has literally nearly wiped out 8 million seats in 1 week. And we thought that was dramatic. But now, as COVID-19 spreads across the globe in both directions through both the Eastern Pacific region into the United States and, of course, into the Western Hemisphere and Europe, last week we saw a 53% reduction in capacity compared to the 16th of March in Europe. And that might seem dramatic, and believe me, it is. I've never seen numbers like that in my life. But I can assure you next week's numbers will be even more dramatic, because a large slug of US international capacity, large pieces of the Ryanair network and other airlines, and Emirates, of course, who've recently announced their cutbacks, and indeed almost scaling back to, I think it's about 5% of their operation, will impact those numbers further. And you can see that Europe in the last week has been the most impacted region of the globe, followed by Latin America. There are lockdowns, and I'm sure you're aware, places like Peru have 400 British nationals stranded in Cuzco trying to get home. I think I'd stay there and drink the beer personally, but that's their choice. And then all the way through. And interestingly, in terms of those glimmers of hope, look at Northeast Asia. And whilst in the context of the 20th of January, we're at half of the capacity that we saw 10 weeks ago, we are now at a point where they have plateaued out, and capacity actually is beginning to recover. So we'll share some more with you on that a bit later in this presentation. So Juraj, if you wouldn't mind turning on, and just this week's movers and shakers, this is sort of like the bottom of the charts, really. This is the place you don't want to be. And Peru has, as I just touched upon, essentially closed its airspace to nearly every flight and has seen a 71% reduction in capacity. But if I could draw your attention to the left-hand side, it just begins to highlight how much impact we are seeing in Europe at the moment. Those are the top 10 countries in terms of percentage change week on week. 7 of those countries are in Europe: Portugal, Spain, Finland, Denmark, Poland, Austria, and Greece. And they are all around 2/3 fewer seats than they offered this time last week. And as I say, I think we're going to see a further downturn from there. So the focus, the epicenter of COVID-19, we know for everyone is in Western Europe, and aviation is certainly following that trend as well. So Juraj, thank you. If you can skip on. I looked at it by individual Western European country, and I didn't, when I first cut these numbers, I wondered whether I should try and do this by the size of the market. But I then thought, well, actually percentage decline is probably the most dramatic measurement. And for someone like the Faroe Islands, we may well say, well, it's only 1,200 seats that they have this week, and it was only 5,200 last week. But trust me, if you are on an island and you lose 3,000 weekly seats, then obviously the dynamics of living there, access to the rest of the world, and such things changes dramatically. And then you can see some of the big markets such as Spain, where essentially 1.5 million seats have been lost in the space of 1 week. And then Finland, 200,000, Denmark, 239,000, I think it is. And then you look at Germany, 1 million fewer seats this week than there was 7 days ago. So these are big numbers, in the United Kingdom 1.3. So it begins to give you, I hope, an indication of the scale and the size of the challenge that we're facing. And every one of us who's on this webinar is in some way or other touched. Our businesses are impacted. Our futures, our careers are hanging in the balance as we see our way through this. Thank you, Juraj. So what does that mean? Well, airline capacity is changing on a daily basis. 251 scheduled airlines had filed capacity to operate last week. This week, that is down to 215, and that does include the non-Western European carriers. So, you know, it includes the likes of American or Emirates or Etihad flying into Western Europe as much as the locally domiciled carriers. But staggeringly, 61 of those airlines, 28% of those airlines, will operate less than 1,000 seats this week. And to put that in context, that's probably around the equivalent of 5 A320 single-aisle European services. And airlines such as Air Serbia, Cyprus Airways, Royal Air Morocco, and Tunisair have completely cut all of their services in Western Europe. And we're going to see more of this. We're going to really, really scale back to the real core operations of these carriers. Thank you. If you could move on. So Juraj, I hand the floor back to you. I think, you know, the context is set. We all know it. Perhaps the scale is bigger than we thought. I would suggest if anyone wants to, they look at the OAG Insights, where we post this every week for them. And equally, happy to take any request for data through LinkedIn and other such channels at a later stage.
Yes, thanks a lot, John, for the overview. Jeremy, planes are grounded, people don't fly, revenues don't come in. From your perspective, which factors are crucial to take into consideration when we try to understand for how long airlines can survive under these circumstances?
Well, one of the very big factors, Juraj, is the willingness of governments to step in and the form in which they may be prepared to step in. Some governments historically have shown far more willingness to intervene to protect aspects of their aviation industry than others. And most recently, the Italian government renationalized Alitalia. This happened, of course, during a situation in which Alitalia was once again under detailed investigation by the European Commission in relation to alleged unlawful state aid, so state subsidies. So there is a question of now of how governments will react. The EU has been very, very quick in responding to the COVID-19 crisis by not only starting to approve EU member states' requests for granting state aid in different sectors very, very quickly, much quicker than would ever happen in normal times, but they've also issued a temporary framework for member states to follow when thinking about granting state subsidies. And we know that the aviation industry has not been shy in making its views known about what support might be needed. And those calls have come from the US airline industry, from IATA, from Airports Council International. And we also know from news reports that different airlines are in discussion with for example, the UK government over the shape and scope of some form of bailout. But I think we're going to go and talk about this a little bit later, what that bailout might look like, who it benefits, for how long it benefits, what is the structure of that, and what is the ultimate price to pay are going to be open questions, and they're going to be highly controversial.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jeremy. John, from your perspective, really simple question: how long do you think airlines can wait for this lockdown to end? 2 months, 3 months?
Well, it depends. It depends entirely upon what their cash reserves are, of course, and how comfortable you feel or you don't. I mean, there are obviously some airlines, you know, IAG, for instance, who sit on a fairly large pot of cash and therefore are, you know, sweating it out perhaps on the basis that it's that moment in time when the fittest of the fittest survive and they have the cash reserves and they're able to work their way through it. But equally, for most carriers, this could not have happened at a worse possible time. You know, March, April, we all begin to see the daffodils appear. We all begin to think about holidays. We begin to book. Cash flow is at its weakest point for many carriers, and this has just impacted them so badly. I think we're talking 5 or 6 weeks maximum. And I think, you know, there is a bitter irony in all of this situation that we face now, that if this had happened 3 weeks earlier, and we were at this moment in time 3 weeks earlier, then actually Flybe might have survived. Because they would have been right at the front in terms of that regional connectivity argument and all of the things that we want to see in terms of connections. So I think 5 to 6 weeks, you're right. And if we don't get government support, be it taking shareholding, be it, you know, soft loans, guarantees, whatever it happens to be, then we are going to see some airlines collapse. But let's turn it round. Are there too many airlines in Europe anyway?
Yeah, we already had a discussion a couple of times on our podcast that consolidation is inevitable, and we didn't know when we were talking about it 2 months ago that it will happen as a result of a virus. So Jeremy, back to you. What John already started in a little bit from your perspective, what forms this support potentially from the governments can have? in which ways they can support the airlines?
There are many different ways that governments can support airlines within the rules. The most obvious one under the current crisis framework will be to say, well, look, there can be grants, there can be loans, there can be loan guarantees, there can be deferment of tax payments, pretty much anything, any form of finance coming from government would be a form of state aid. It would have to go through the processes for getting that notified and approved. But essentially, the governments could choose whatever they thought was the best way through it. The choice they make will depend on their objectives and what they want at the end of it, because it's one thing to say, okay, well, we're going to bail out certain businesses within the aviation industry, be they airlines, airports, combination. It's another thing to say, well, how's this going to look in 5-10 years' time? If we take an airline onto our books, are we going to aim to privatize it again, sell it back? Are we just giving the money, or are we just giving loans on preferential rates with a view to at least getting some return now? And ultimately, that's going to be a government choice. It's a fairly free choice for them. What we've heard as regards the UK, at least as far as is known in the public domain, is exactly what that support might look like is going to be subject to heavy negotiation. There will be a price to pay for cash today at the end of the day, and airlines may be looking at this now and say, well, look, we want support, we need support, but ultimately government will have to find a way to bring that support to an end, and then at some stage restore the effect of market forces. But this inevitably comes back to the question of who's going to get that support. And John, you're absolutely right. Timing can be both fortunate and unfortunate for certain airlines. Would one say, okay, we want to make sure that all those airlines that were operational and in reasonably good shape as at a certain date would qualify for support? So essentially we freeze market forces on a certain date, and then at a certain date that is determined when the crisis has passed, the switch is flipped again, market forces apply again, and the airlines are then on their own. Or do governments then say, well, actually, we want to be selective. Money has to go to a range of different sources in the crisis. It's interesting, the poll, Juraj, that you put up at the very beginning, obviously with an audience such as we have today, it is unsurprising that a large majority want to see support to the airline industry, to the aviation industry prioritised. It would be interesting to put that to a more general business audience. I'm sure many people would say that aviation should be prioritised, but should every business within the aviation industry be prioritised? Well, that's a whole different question.
Yeah, John, you wanted to react on that.
It's a real. There is no right or wrong answer in all of this. But what it does strike me is that if we're going to work on the principle of the fittest should survive through this event, then some really hard decisions have to be made. And I'll just put this out there: why should the UK be seeking to prop up a failing long-haul airline that is domiciled in the UK but has major US airline stakeholder investment? And I'm referring to Virgin Atlantic. Over an economic cycle, over the history of the airline, they have never sustained a lengthy period of profitability. And there is a fundamental flaw in their network, actually, that will always be there whilst we only have 2 runways at Heathrow, which is a lack of structured connectivity and a hugely reliant network on the North American market. So it poses a question: why would the government want to bail them out? And when we compare the situation we face now to the banking sector in 2008, inherently most of those businesses were profitable. They had some lousy loans and some lousy debts, but banks tend to make money most of the time. They're quite good at that. But I think this also moves on to another area, which and someone has touched in one of the questions. This isn't just about airlines. This is about airports as much as it is airlines. There are 7 or 8 airports in the United Kingdom, regional airports in the United Kingdom alone at this moment in time, that were so heavily reliant on Flybe for 80-95% of their capacity and revenue, and they've lost that, and they're backfilling that as quickly as they possibly can. They'll never replace that. But what are we going to do about those airports, and are they all survivable? And I think we've got some really hard questions that we need to answer in the United Kingdom about our aviation strategy per se, and probably throughout the rest of Europe as well at this moment in time. It is a defining moment. What this country needs, and what we all need now, are decent aviation consultants to work our way through this. And I can't think of any while I'm sitting here.
We have very interesting questions already coming in from the audience. Let's stay in the UK for a second. We have a question from Joe Bailey from Simple Flying. Simple questions, definitely. Maybe you can try simple answer, John. Should the UK take stakes in its airlines? How would that work with IAG ownership of BA?
Hi, Joe. I suspect it's all about similar structures to we had with the banking crisis, that they take equity stock at a value, probably today's valuation if they could, and then from there, if we look forward 4 or 5 years, we'd like to think that the economy had recovered, the airline industry was in a better shape, and as a consequence, the government could sell out its stake. Who knows?
Yeah, potentially. Question from your colleague, John, from Deidre. What capacity do we think governments will have to deal with supporting airlines with firefighting the crisis in general? Maybe that's one for you, Jeremy.
Shall I take it first then? The government's got a lot of demands on its time and its resources. Yeah. Plainly, aviation plays a fundamental role in the UK economy. Those figures that were put up earlier about the percentage of GDP connected to the aviation industry, the UK is obviously not as severely dependent as, for example, Spain, but it's still a very, very significant number. And some things, and this is moving to the positive discussion, some things will have to get back to a type of normality. The current situation will not last forever. That said, the UK government has performed a very fast, screeching handbrake turn in its policy in dealing with the health aspects of this crisis, and has its hands full. So whilst there is bandwidth to discuss matters of bailouts and support, if you compare, for example, how quickly the Danish government notified its first proposal for state aid to deal with the crisis to the Commission, and the Commission who responded by authorising the Danish government to give that state aid within 24 hours of that notification. And here we are after 1 week, or more than 1 week, of discussion of a potential UK Airlines bailout, and it hasn't happened yet. So that would suggest that either those discussions are proving quite fraught, or that the UK government can't yet put enough capacity into discussing that question.
Well, thanks for answering the question. John, this one is for you from another John, from our colleague, John Barcroft. He's asking about, referring to UK government already taking control of the railway system. So do you think that this could happen as a transition window in the airline industry in Europe and potentially worldwide?
No, I don't. It's lovely to have John on here. Obviously, his hearing aid is working again, which is brilliant. But I think the competitive dynamic of that would be so far reaching in terms of other countries crying foul. We either renationalize aviation and call it Wright Brothers Airways, or, you know, we're going to have to accept each individual country or market is going to have to find a way through this. But there has to be, and I think Jeremy would agree, there has to be an end, or there has to be an expectation of when the end would be to that support, or what is the way to exit from that investment, because otherwise it's just state aid, isn't it? Is it, Jeremy? I think it would be state aid, wouldn't it?
Well, it would almost certainly be state aid. The question is not whether it's state aid, because there's a generous and broad framework by which European governments can give state aid, and that's just been massively expanded by the Commission. The question is really, how soon can it end? How much is it going to cost us in the long term as taxpayers? Who gets it? And how do you exit, as you rightly say, how do you exit from the state aid in a situation where the aviation industry, as it is at that point, can then go on to prosper? And actually, at this point, there was a question from one of my colleagues, Lucien, about the cyclical nature of the aviation industry, and would COVID-19 essentially represent the start of a new cycle? I suppose you could say that where we are, and with the figures that you showed earlier, John, aviation industry is pretty much at a ground zero level. We've gone right the way back. So anything from here, or anything from your next set of figures, will represent a turnaround. I think the really interesting future focused question, and this may govern how we look at the support that is given now, is what kind of aviation industry are we going to have at the top of the next cycle? If we can cast our minds forward a few years, what will that look like compared to the top of the most recent cycle? Aviation is very good at throwing a lot more capacity when times are good, so that capacity expands, and there have been some very benign periods in the last decades where the availability of cheap flights, together with liberal aviation policies, particularly in the EU single aviation area, and a reasonable amount of money in consumers' pockets, have enabled a fantastic expansion, both internationally and also interregionally. If we look at what the world looks like after the COVID-19 crisis, we have a situation where, for one thing, different regions of the world have gone into and will emerge from this crisis at different times. And so if you're thinking about connectivity between point of origin and point of destination, not all of your points of origin and destination will revive at the same time. Then if you look at, well, how are we doing this today? You know, normally we would get together around a table in a conference room, but now we've got a conference with, what, there are 63 participants on this webinar. We are all getting used to working online and remotely as a norm rather than as an exception to the norm. People are having to put up with incredible restrictions on their freedom of movement and on what they normally do in their lives. And yet, this is producing a vast outpouring of creativity in how people collaborate with each other and how people connect. And then if you also look at the feature that, as you said, Juraj, earlier, we're going to be in an absolutely colossal recession. And at the end of that recession, how much money are people and businesses going to have to fund flying? So it may be that we are at the start of a new cycle, but it may be a cycle that takes a very long time to get to a peak. John, you'll, I'm sure, have views on that. But in that context, if you're a government thinking about whether or not or how much to bail out the aviation industry, surely, as a matter of prudence, you ought to have some regard to what is the world going to look like, and do we want to be financing everybody to stick capacity back in the market as if this was still 2015? Or do we want to say, well, hold on, let's take things steadily. We don't want to be overexposed when there is the possibility of another correction down the track, which would damage the value of the investments we're making now. Or where we've got COVID-19 now, but what about COVID-20, COVID-21 mutations? What if we have to shut down the global economy again in a few years' time? How badly exposed are we to that? A whole bunch of different considerations arise. And so, yes, we may be at the start of a new cycle, but it could be a very, very long cycle. And we may end up with an industry which for a very long time is reduced compared to what it has been in recent times.
Coming back to the original topic of supporting the airlines from the government side, I think one of the crucial questions here is that how to distinguish which airlines are eligible to get a support from any kind of form from the government. Let's say in UK you already have couple of examples. So of course there is a national carrier, let's say BA. So does that mean that they are a national carrier that they are automatically eligible for such a support? And let's say Logan Air or somebody like that, or EasyJet. What's your take on that, John?
Well, very interesting. It's such a difficult question, isn't it? You're right. It's easy to ask and difficult to answer. BA are, they may perceive themselves as a national flag carrier. They may project themselves with that brand, but let's be honest, they're part of a consortium that its head office is in Madrid. A large part of its shareholding and ownership is spread around the world, with a very large slug in Qatar. So, is that a British airline? It operates in the UK market, absolutely, and it connects the rest of the world. But it is, and its value is just as important as the value of Logan Air and what Jonathan's doing up in Scotland with that network and filling in gaps and making sure that connectivity is retained as much as possible. But the real challenge here is that, this is a moment where we could consolidate the industry and put it in a better place for a longer term future. And that may mean that we have to accept that, the existing ownership rules that we have between countries and some of the anomalies that creates are taken away, and that we give up on our national airlines and those sort of historic flag carrying things, and that we see transportation and air services as a service provision by a company that happens to provide that service. And I think it's really difficult to find a way through this, and I don't think we will come up with a perfect solution. And the problem is, whenever you devise a set of rules, trust me, whenever you devise a set of rules, someone finds a way around those rules to circumnavigate them for their own benefit. And quite frequently, when those rules are established, if you want to circumnavigate them and find a solution, you just need to go to Rome and speak to a national airline there, because they find ways around the rules that no one else would think was even probable. It may be papal intervention or something else, but why that carrier is still in existence is beyond me, and it's blatantly unfair for every other airline in Europe to see what happens there so frequently.
Of course, Jeremy wants to react.
Yes, but I don't necessarily want to react to disagree. I mean, leaving aside the question of Alitalia's multiple state interventions over a very, very long period, going back decades, really, the bigger question is a policy one, which is, why would the Italian government wish to maintain an airline that had struggled so long to prosper, if it were not for the fact that it remains the case that for many countries, having a national airline is an important part of that country's brand. But it does seem to be a retrograde step, unless there is to be a very substantial restructuring that for once would have the objective of and the effect of making Alitalia a profitable carrier. But I want to go to a more fundamental point which you raised, Juraj, which is, the who benefits question amongst airlines. One way of looking at this is to say, look, those who are really profitable before the crisis get first dibs on the pot of money. That has understandably, well, not surprisingly, been dismissed by amongst others, IATA, who have said in recent days, no, we shouldn't basically take a broadsword to the industry. We should support the industry essentially as it is. But of course, the world has changed in a number of different ways, and there are a number of difficult policy points to respond to. One is that when it comes to, say, short-haul flying within Europe, the argument has been raised by the Alliance of Passenger Rail new entrants to say, well, hold on, we think that support for rail needs to be prioritised over support for short-haul flying because rail has a cleaner environmental footprint. So that opens up the second front. So you have the airlines versus airlines rivalry saying, we should get it because we're strong, useful, national brand, whatever, and you shouldn't because you're historically weak or whatever. So airline versus airline, and then airline versus rail. And again, if you cast your mind forward, what has been achieved by COVID-19 is probably wildly beyond the dreams of Extinction Rebellion in what they might reasonably achieve in curbing flying. The question is, when aviation returns, it will return with all of those environmental questions still to deal with. And governments, ever more conscious that they have to play a role in dealing with climate change, are going to be careful, at the very least, of being seen to give too much of an advantage to the aviation sector. And that may, in some governments' minds, argue against a blank check approach to the aviation sector.
Juraj, there's a
John, go ahead. Yeah,
there's a staggeringly intelligent question from Tony Hallwood around APD and whether we should actually waive that as we come out of that in the United Kingdom. And that also leads on to a question from Robert Atkins, who I went to school with, and he was educated and I wasn't. But I think the really deep thing that everyone needs to really pay attention to here is it's not just about the capacity coming back, it's about the demand coming back. And to Jeremy's point about video conferencing and corporate duty of care, and are people going to spend their money traveling long haul, or will they only travel regionally? Collectively, there is a huge task to be undertaken to restore confidence for people to travel. And that's about the product. It's about all sorts of things, from the cleanliness of the aircraft on a 45-minute turnaround, and people getting paranoid about these sort of things in today's hysterical market. And APD when APD was introduced many years ago, we were assured by the UK Treasury to a meeting of UK airlines that it would be used for the benefit of aviation. And that was one of the biggest lies that the government ever said, because I haven't seen a penny of it go towards UK aviation. But ultimately, we've got to find a way to not only get capacity back, but get people back and to restore their confidence. I mean, I wonder how many people who've got timeshare properties in Europe, who fly 10 times every summer back and forth. They probably haven't made any bookings at this moment in time. They won't be coming back quickly. It's a big issue. We need to find a solution.
It's very hard to avoid the topic of EasyJet when we are talking about what we are talking today. So there are two perspectives on that. First, towards you, Jeremy. Joe Bailey is asking, I'm not sure if you are even able to have the right answer is, so was EasyJet really obliged to pay all those millions to their shareholders as they are claiming?
I don't think I can comment on that specifically as regards EasyJet, but it does, I think the question plays into a broader debate, one that's been quite active in the United States from what I've seen, between what might be called the deserving airlines and the undeserving airlines. And the debate in the United States has been about in the US, there's been a request for a $50 billion bailout of the aviation industry, to which some commentators have responded, well, what about all those share buybacks that carriers such as American did during the years of plenty, rather than saving up cash for the leaner years? And because they've done that for the benefit of earnings per share and shareholders, but not for the customers, while many have complained of a decline in service standards, they would then fall in, according to that commentator, into the undeserving airline category. In response to that, I suppose airlines try and take decisions in a complex set of circumstances for a variety of reasons, and the policy decision will be to say, well, where do you draw the line on what is deserving behaviour and undeserving behaviour? What stage do you essentially socialise to the taxpayer the costs of what, in retrospect, look like mistakes that were made when no one was predicting that a pandemic would wipe out global flying? So I can't speak directly to the EasyJet question, but it is part of this broader question about who should get it and how much and in what form, and to repeat, how do you get out of this mess at the end?
It does make me chuckle that good old Donald is going to establish the criteria for deserving airlines. Obviously, it's if you watch Fox News rather than ABC that you'll get qualified. But yeah, you're right. There are just so many issues, and the airlines are part of it. But I think we should also perhaps think about the airports in the wider context of AviaDev Europe and those smaller airports. How are they going to survive through this? Jeremy, presumably they're not going to qualify for any bailouts or any support or anything. They'll have to go back to their shareholders directly, I presume.
Well, it's interesting. I don't want to comment about any specific airports, but it is a considerable challenge, because if you think that under European law, under European state aid law, there is an instrument, a set of guidelines from the European Commission that date back to 2014, which set out the basis on which investment aid, operating aid, and startup aid may be justifiable in the context of airlines and airports. And these guidelines were somewhat controversial when they entered into force. A lot of people said, well, the Commission's proposed restrictions on the amount of aid that could be given to airlines and airports just to keep things going on an operating basis, whereby you basically get a 10-year window to move yourself towards a sustainable basis of profitability, was too restrictive, and so on and so forth. But that controversy has died down. But if you look at it through the lens of this crisis, it seems to me that those guidelines have essentially become obsolete, and that trying to funnel aid to sort of compatible state aid to airports, particularly smaller regional airports, in this situation is going to be particularly difficult. But on the other hand, one of the flexibilities there is in the legal system is that money that is there to create connectivity doesn't necessarily have to be state aid and fall within legal restrictions on state aid. But essentially, one of those tools is to create a structure which would mirror what a market economy investor or market economy operator would do. So if there is support from, shall we say, a state-financed airport to an airline to create connectivity, this can either be done in a way which is state aid but is considered compatible and lawful, or it can be done in a way which is not state aid at all. The problem is, and this comes back to your point, John, the problem is that without serious passenger demand, it's going to be very difficult to do any of those kinds of structures at all. And for that reason, in the current environment, those 2014 guidelines, frankly, look obsolete. So the question then is, well, what of regional flying? Well, I think anyone who's involved in this conversation today can appreciate the benefits of flying from airports local to you to destinations on a point-to-point basis that may be precisely where you want to go. But in the current environment, whilst we're waiting to see what kind of aviation industry emerges, what kind of demand recovery there is, it's going to be pretty tough out there for quite a lot of regional airports.
That was my second part of the question regarding EasyJet. So Stelios, one of the largest shareholder of EasyJet, he mentioned earlier today or yesterday that EasyJet should probably scale down from 350 something to 250 aircraft. So that, following up one of the questions from the audience, so definitely the position of many regional airports all across Europe will be totally different than it is today. And what's the way forward for them, John?
Well, I think you have to be careful, because with Stelios, there's probably a hidden agenda, because he's not directly involved in the business as much as he was, and he's got his personal axes to grind. But I think it's a good point, because every airline has a number of routes that will be in intensive care. And they look at every year and they're saying, well, that's a marginal one, and that's why we see so much churn, and that's why we see frequencies being adjusted from daily to 3 a week, 5 a week, whatever it happens to be. But the dilemma for any airline is leaving itself with stranded cost. So it cuts 100 aircraft out, but it's still got a load of overhead costs that are stranded, and it cannot displace, or it cannot be as effective as it used to be. And for an airline, of course, particularly a low-cost airline, it is all about asset utilization, productivity, and hours, and sweating that as much as you can. So it may be that 150 aircraft could be furloughed. Someone said to me earlier this morning, this is a really interesting time, because every airline business model that we have seen and worked with in the last 10 years and renewal, and ever to be aware that because they had it yesterday doesn't mean they'll have that service in 3 months' time, and that everything is back up for grabs. And people have asked some interesting questions about pricing, and what will happen with airfares? Will they go up? Well, trust me, if I was the CEO of an airline, I would worthless revenue, even though I'm desperate for cash. The last thing I need to do is to generate that cash them as much as you can, because they need it, and we're all in this together.
Sorry for that. It's technical issues on my side, but I'm back. Jeremy, final remarks from your side, and please also do touch a topic of the EU. Do you think will there be some kind of joint approach from the EU level regarding the support for the airlines, or every country will have to deal with it individually?
I'm sorry, I didn't. There was a bandwidth problem, so I think your question is about the balance between EU and national level support.
What do you think? What do you expect if there will be a joint approach from the EU level regarding support for the airlines, or every country will have to deal with it on an individual basis?
What I expect right now is that the EU will set a framework within which member states of the EU will determine their own policy. So obviously the Commission has issued a temporary state aid framework to deal with this emergency, and that has 5 limbs of different types of aid that can be granted in different situations, which is in addition to all the state aid that can be granted through different frameworks by member states today. So that would be the way that the money passes. It would go from member states under an approved legal mechanism to, let's say, aviation businesses, and it would be up to the member states to determine what they choose to support.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. Before we move to the final part of today's webinar, which is John sharing some rays of positivity with us, I would like to do a second poll about something that we haven't talked about yet, but maybe something for the next webinar. So here we go. Second poll is on. In addition to the government aid, do you think we will see airlines working closer together in order to create synergies and recover quicker? Of course, those airlines that will survive this, because obviously there will be some casualties here. So we haven't touched on that really yet today, but something, as I said, for potentially for one of the next webinars. So it's not that clear what the audience thinks. So at the moment is 57% saying yes, that we can expect the airlines working closer together. 41% of our audience thinks that they don't expect that. So I will end this poll on that. So now it's 62 versus 38. So thanks everyone for voting. And now, please, John, at AviaDev, we always try to be positive. So we know that history showed us that every crisis passed and the industry always came back stronger after that. We definitely know this crisis will pass as well. So, John, can you close today's webinar with some rays of positivity?
Sure, you're expecting me to be positive.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let us share a couple of things. Hopes of recovery. I think we're beginning to see signs of recovery, and someone asked in one of the questions, where are we and what could happen? And that's beginning to happen in China. And reassuringly, my two colleagues, Rebecca and Deirdre, and I were on a call with some colleagues in Singapore who look at Northeast Asia. And they were saying it's not just in China we're beginning to see a recovery. We're actually beginning to see a recovery in both Japan and South Korea in terms of capacity as well. And it may have been artificially created. I mean, I'm sure many of you have heard of the cabbage fares that have been offered in China to try and get people who were trapped by Chinese New Year back home so they could get back into the factories and start production. But to that point about the lag in demand is the key question, and people do need to start planning for future. So there are a couple of charts I've put together which perhaps will stop you from going out of here and slashing your wrist or trying to jump in front of a train. But if you're trying to jump in front of a Thameslink service, you'll probably break your leg before the train turns up. This is the historic picture. If you go all the way back to 1996, and you can see the growth in the number of seats in the market that have been delivered. And it's accelerated at a phenomenal rate since about 2011. And equally, the number of airport pairs, the services between 2 points has been growing extremely rapidly as well, particularly off the back of low-cost airlines. But if you were presenting that to a client or you were looking at that, you would probably say to yourself, this is unsustainable for a much longer period of time, because this is exponential growth that is just running away with itself. And, you know, in 10 years' time, we might actually look at this and say, well, this is just a reset. This is a reset moment in the aviation industry to more sustainable, sensible levels of growth. And if you go back to 2009, when we had, you know, the economic crisis, and if you go to 2011 in particular, you know, and you go to 2001, these are just really smoothed out blips. And at this moment of crisis, when we're living with it, it's really challenging for us. So when do we get out of this? Well, you're right. If you could share the last slide that I produced, and this is just illustrative. It's not a definitive position. But we ran a scenario. If you If you take some hope out of China's situation, and we assume that global capacity bottoms out by the end of April this year, and that quite frankly, we can't see any more capacity coming out after then, because at the rate it's going out at the moment, and allowing for the fact that China is coming back, we're going to get down to about 39 million seats a week around the world. And in a best case scenario, where you look at 2% of capacity being added back in every week, which isn't unreasonable, because at a macro level, that allows one airline to add quite a lot of capacity in one part of the world and somewhere else. We could, in a really positive world, be back with capacity at similar levels to January 2020 by mid-October of this year. Whether demand follows is a completely different question. But if you take a slightly longer term perspective, then it's going to be as far out as May 2021 if we have 2% compound growth as opposed to 4% compound growth if we bottom out at the end of April. And of course, you can move that along. So there are some glimmers beginning to occur. It's a long way to get back, and we've got a long way to go. And the most important thing is not just capacity, but we understand demand and how to generate more demand, but profitable demand. So let's not give up. There's lots to be positive about. If you go back to the previous slide, you can see how successful this industry has been, and every one of us makes a valuable contribution to that. So it's a moment for us all to stick in there together. And at the end of the day, there will be an AviaDev Europe. There is a rumor that Juraj will buy some people a beer. There will be an AviaDev Africa, and it's very, very definitely sure that John Howe will buy everyone a beer. So, let's work towards getting to that position, and the sooner the better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for this raise of positivity. I think that's definitely something we can finish today. But before we say goodbye, I have one last poll for you, for everybody on the webinar. The most important question of today, I just launched the poll. Who has nicer headphones, myself or John? I think
come on.
I think
Please.
John's are from BBC, so I'm not sure I can compete with that. But
yeah, these are BBC.
By the way, John, thanks.
I can't see the vote. I can't see the vote.
At the moment, it's 62% for myself. So I will share the votes with everyone. By the way, can you explain? Yes. Can you explain to everybody in the audience why you needed to change the shirt, and what does it says on your shirt?
Because this was my first employer, and I thought I should pay homage to them because they were one of those airlines that nasty state-owned British Airways acquired when Maggie Thatcher was apparently in charge of the government.
British Caledonian, yeah. So I'm sure there are some your ex or former colleagues in the audience as well.
John Barcroft would certainly remember it, and I think Tony Hallwood was probably alive when they were flying as well.
Okay, so let's end the poll. I can share the results. So 63% of our audience thinks that I have nicer headphones.
Can I just ask, did my two colleagues vote for me?
I'm afraid the poll was anonymous, so I can't tell you. But
I know the answer. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, Jeremy and John, thanks a lot for your time. Thanks a lot for sharing your opinions with us.
Thanks for inviting us.
It was great to have you, and also thank you everybody in the audience for joining us for today's webinar. As promised, we will. We have the recording. We will put it on YouTube tomorrow. Follow us on LinkedIn, AviaDev Europe. We will share the YouTube link over there tomorrow, and we will be back next week, same time, Tuesday, 31st March at 1 o'clock London time, and we will talk about the airport perspective to all of this and the way forward for the airports. Yes, John?
And you're right. Don't forget about AviaDev Consult. We can help you out of this, guys.
Of course, yeah. We will we will send everybody a nice letter from you who will join the webinar next week from the airport perspective. So again, thanks a lot everybody for joining us, and see you next week at another webinar of AviaDev Europe. Thanks a lot. Cheers.